Good morning, everybody. The 10,085th meeting of the Security Council is called to an order. As this is the first formal meeting of the Security Council this year, I should like to extend my warm wishes on the new year to all members of the Security Council, the United Nations, and the Secretariat. In presiding over this first formal meeting of the Council in 2026, I'm happy to welcome the new members, Bahrain, Colombia, Democratic Republic of Congo, Latvia, and Liberia. We look forward to their participation in the work of the Council. Their experience and wisdom will be invaluable assistance in the discharge of the Council's responsibility. I shall also take this opportunity to express the Council's gratitude to the outgoing members, namely Algeria, Guyana, Republic of Korea, Sierra Leone, and Slovenia, for their important contributions to the work of the Council during their terms. I shall also like to take this opportunity to pay tribute on behalf of the Council to His Excellency, Mr. Samuel Zobogar, a permanent representative of Slovenia, for his service as the President of the Council for the month of December. I'm sure I speak for all members of the Council in expressing deep appreciation to Ambassador Zobogar and his team for this great diplomatic skill with which they conducted the Council's business last month. The provisional agenda of this meeting is the threat to international peace and security. The agenda is adopted. In accordance with Rule 37 of the Council's Provisional Rules of Procedure, I invite the representatives of Argentina, Brazil, Chile, Cuba, Eritrea, Islamic Republic of Iran, Mexico, Nicaragua, Paraguay, South Africa, Spain, Trinidad and Tobago, Uganda, and the Bolivarian Republic of Venezuela to participate in this meeting. It's so decided. In accordance with Rule 39 of the Council's Provisional Rules of the Procedure, I invite the following briefers to participate in this meeting. Ms. Rosemary DiCarlo, the Undersecretary General for the Political and Peace-Building Affairs. Mr. Jeffrey Sachs, President of UN Sustainable Development Solutions Network and Director of Center for Sustainable Development at Columbia University, and Ms. Mercedes de Freitas, Founder and Executive Director of Transparencia Venezuela. It's so decided. Security Council will now begin its consideration for item 2 of the agenda. I now give the floor to Ms. Rosemary DiCarlo.
Thank you, Mr. President. Today, I'm going to deliver a statement from Secretary General Antonio Guterres, who was not able to be here this morning. Mr. President, members of the Security Council, we meet at a grave time following the 3 January United States military action in the Bolivarian Republic of Venezuela. The broad outlines of the events of Saturday have been widely reported. Early that day, U.S. forces were active across Caracas and in the northern states of Miranda, Aragua, and La Guaira. The extent of casualties resulting from these actions remains undetermined. In a statement on social media on Saturday, President Donald Trump announced the conduct of a, I quote, large-scale strike against Venezuela and its leader, President Nicolas Maduro, end quote. During a press conference on Saturday, President Trump stated, and I quote again, "We are going to run the country until such time that we can do a safe, proper, and judicious transition," end quote. The government of Venezuela has characterized the United States action as a military aggression carried out in civilian and military areas and as a flagrant violation of the Charter, posing a threat to international and regional peace and security. As we speak, President Maduro is being held in New York, accused by U.S. authorities, along with his wife, Celia Flores, of serious criminal offenses. What is less certain is the immediate future of Venezuela. I am deeply concerned about the possible intensification of the instability in the country, the potential impact on the region, and the precedent it may set for how relations between and among states are conducted. Mr. President, the situation in Venezuela has been a matter of regional and international concern for many years now. Attention on the country only grew following the contested presidential elections in July 2024. The panel of electoral experts I appointed at the Venezuelan government's request to accompany the elections highlighted serious issues. We have consistently called for the full transparency and the complete publication of the results of the elections. As reported to the Council on 23 December, the Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights has cataloged serious violations. On 3 January, Venezuelan interim President Delcy Rodriguez invoked an emergency decree throughout the national territory, extending additional security powers to the government. Mr. President, the latest developments follow a period of heightened tensions beginning in mid-August, as discussed in this Council on 2 previous occasions. I have consistently stressed the imperative of full respect by all for international law, including the Charter of the United Nations, which provides the foundation for the maintenance of international peace and security. I remain deeply concerned that rules of international law have not been respected with regard to the 3 January military action. The Charter enshrines the prohibition of the threat or use of force against the territorial integrity or political independence of any state. The maintenance of international peace and security depends on the continued commitment of all member states to adhere to all the provisions of the Charter. Mr. President, Venezuela has experienced decades of internal instability and social and economic turmoil. Democracy has been undermined. Millions of its people have fled the country. The situation is critical, but it is still possible to prevent a wider and more destructive conflagration. I call on all Venezuelan actors to engage in an inclusive, democratic dialogue in which all sectors of society can determine their future. This entails the full respect of human rights, the rule of law, and the sovereign will of the Venezuelan people. I also urge Venezuela's neighbors and the international community more broadly to act in a spirit of solidarity and in adherence to the principles, laws, and rules erected to promote peaceful coexistence. I welcome and am ready to support all efforts aimed at assisting Venezuelans in finding a peaceful way forward. Mr. President, Excellencies, in situations as confused as complex as the one we now face, it is important to stick to principles. Respect for the UN Charter and all other applicable legal frameworks to safeguard peace and security. Respect for the principles of sovereignty, political independence, and territorial integrity of states. The prohibition of the threat or use of force. The power of the law must prevail. International law contains tools to address issues such as illicit traffic in narcotics, disputes about resources, and human rights concerns. This is the route we need to take. Thank you, Mr. President.
I thank Ms. DiCarlo for her briefings. I now give the floor to Mr. Jeffrey Sachs.
Mr. President, distinguished members of the Security Council, the issue before the Council today is not the character of the government of Venezuela. The issue is whether any member state, by force, coercion, or economic strangulation, has the right to determine Venezuela's political future or to exercise control over its affairs. This question goes directly to Article 2, Section 4 of the United Nations Charter, which prohibits the threat or use of force against the territorial integrity or political independence of any state. The Council must decide whether that prohibition is to be upheld or abandoned. Abandoning it would carry consequences of the gravest kind. Let me offer some background. Since 1947, the United States foreign policy has repeatedly employed force, covert action, and political manipulation to bring about regime change in other countries. This is a matter of carefully documented historical record. In her book, Covert Regime Change, political scientist Lindsay O'Rourke documents 70 attempted U.S. regime change operations between 1947 and 1989 alone. These practices did not end with the Cold War. Since 1989, major United States regime change operations undertaken without authorization by the Security Council have included, among the most consequential, Iraq 2003, Libya 2011, Syria beginning in 2011, Honduras 2009, Ukraine 2014, and Venezuela from 2002 onward. The methods employed are well established and well documented. They include open warfare, covert intelligence operations, instigation of unrest, support for armed groups, manipulation of mass and social media, bribery of military and civilian officials, targeted assassinations, false flag operations, and economic warfare. These measures are illegal under the UN Charter, and they typically result in ongoing violence, lethal conflict, political instability, and deep suffering of the civilian population. The recent U.S. record with respect to Venezuela is also clear. In April 2002, the U.S. knew of and approved an attempted coup against the government. In the 2010s, the United States funded civil society groups actively engaged in anti-government protests. When the government cracked down on the protests, the U.S. followed with a series of sanctions. In 2015, President Barack Obama declared Venezuela to be, and I quote, an unusual and extraordinary threat to the national security and foreign policy of the United States. In 2017, at a dinner with Latin American leaders on the margin of the UN General Assembly, President Trump openly discussed the option of the U.S. invading Venezuela to overthrow the government. During 2017 to 2020, the United States imposed sweeping sanctions on the state oil company PDVSA. Oil production fell by 75% from 2016 to 2020, and the real GDP per capita declined by 62%. The UN General Assembly has repeatedly voted overwhelmingly against such unilateral coercive measures. Under international law, only the Security Council has the authority to impose such measures. On the 23rd of January 2019, the United States unilaterally recognized Mr. Juan Guaido as interim president, and a few days later froze approximately $7 billion of Venezuelan sovereign assets held abroad and gave the designated authority over certain of these assets. These actions form part of a continuous U.S. regime change effort spanning more than 2 decades. In the past year, the United States has carried out bombing operations in 7 countries, none of which were authorized by the UN Security Council, and none of which were undertaken in lawful self-defense under the Charter. The targeted countries include Iran, Iraq, Nigeria, Somalia, Syria, Yemen, and now Venezuela. In the past month, President Trump has issued direct threats against 6 UN member states, including Colombia, Denmark, Iran, Mexico, Nigeria, and of course, Venezuela. Members of the Council are not called upon to judge Nicolas Maduro. They are not called upon to assess whether the recent U.S. attack and ongoing naval quarantine results in freedom or in subjugation. Members of the Council are called upon to defend international law, and specifically the UN Charter. The realist school of international relations, articulated most brilliantly by John Mearsheimer, accurately describes the condition of international anarchy as the tragedy of great power politics. Realism is therefore a description, not a solution for peace. Its own conclusion is that anarchy leads to tragedy. In the aftermath of World War I, the League of Nations was created to end the tragedy through the application of international law. Yet the world's leading nations failed to defend international law in the 1930s, leading to renewed global war. The United Nations emerged from that catastrophe as humanity's second great effort to place international law above international anarchy. In the words of the Charter, the UN was created, quote, to save succeeding generations from the scourge of war, which twice in our lifetime has brought untold sorrow to mankind. Given that we are in the nuclear age, failure cannot be repeated. Humanity would perish. There would be no third chance. To fulfill its responsibilities under the Charter, the Security Council should immediately affirm the following actions. The United States shall immediately cease and desist from all explicit and implicit threats or use of force against Venezuela. The United States shall terminate its naval quarantine and all related coercive military measures undertaken in the absence of authorization by the UN Security Council. The United States shall immediately withdraw its military forces from within and along the perimeter of Venezuela, including intelligence, naval, air, and other forward deployed assets positioned for coercive purposes. Venezuela shall adhere to the UN Charter and to the human rights protected in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. The Secretary General, I recommend, should immediately appoint a special envoy mandated to engage relevant Venezuelan and international stakeholders and to report back to the Security Council within 14 days with recommendations consistent with the Charter, and the Security Council should remain urgently seized of this matter. All member states should refrain from unilateral threats, coercive measures, or armed actions undertaken outside the authority of the UN Security Council. In closing, Mr. President and distinguished members of the Council, peace and the survival of humanity depend on whether the United Nations Charter remains a living instrument of international law or is allowed to wither into irrelevance. That is the choice before this Council today. Thank you very much.
I thank Mr. Sachs for his briefings. I now give the floor to Ms. Mercedes de Frateas. My apology. I now give the floor to Ms. Mercedes de Frateas.
Good morning. I speak in Spanish. Please give the translation. Buenos días, embajadores,
Good morning,
representantes de estados y
ambassadors,
gobiernos.
representatives
Gracias por esta
of states
oportunidad.
and governments. Thank you very much for giving me this opportunity to speak.
Sí, sí, no me escuchan.
Can you hear me?
Aló, aló, ¿me
Can you
escuchan?
hear me?
¿Me
can
escuchan?
hear you,
Disculpa,
yeah.
ya estoy aquí. Excuse me.
Yes, we can hear you.
Good morning. I speak in Spanish. Buenos días, señores embajadores,
Good morning,
representantes de
ambassadors,
estados.
representatives
Gracias por esta
of
oportunidad
heads of
de
state and
presentar los
government.
resultados
Thank
de
you
investigaciones que
to
desde Transparencia
enable me to
Venezuela
tell you something about Transparency
hemos estado
Venezuela,
desarrollando para
the work that we have been doing.
Para la He organizado
We have organized
la información que voy a presentar
I've
en 5 puntos.
I've organized some information I'm going to put forward to you in 5 points.
¿Cómo puedo bajar el volumen?
Continue.
He organizado la información que voy a presentarles en 5 puntos.
I've arranged the information I'm going to give to you in around 5 points. Let me make the most of my time. First of all, one, the corruption in Venezuela is seen in 73 countries of the world. We have organized, we've seen hundreds of cases that we have documented over the years, more than 500, 600 cases in various countries.
Continue, we can hear you. Go ahead, continue. Can you hear us? We can hear you. Can you hear us?
Solo en los sistemas de justicia de 30 países
We looked at the justice
se
systems of
procesaron
30 countries,
172 casos de
and
gran corrupción,
172 cases
donde el
were
60%
dealt
de
with for
ellos
corruption,
suma más de
and
72.000 millones
more
de
than
dólares.
$72 trillion were involved.
Esos 72 millones de dólares que
$1
están
million
comprometidos
were
son
involved.
dinero público venezolano.
This was public
Nicolás
Venezuelan money.
Maduro y su
Nicolas
familia
Maduro and his
son el
family.
foco de la red. Y el puente estructural
The interpreter cannot hear
y el
the
de
speaker.
Petróleos de Venezuela ha sido el instrumento central, involucrada directa e indirectamente en el 90%
It
de
was a
los casos
system
de
that was
corrupción
involved in
que hemos
90%
identificado.
of the corruption
Punto número
cases.
2.
Point number
Las
2,
organizaciones criminales nacionales
the
y
national
internacionales
criminal
tienen una
organizations.
relación simbiótica con la administración de Nicolás Maduro.
The interpreter cannot hear the speech to provide sufficient interpretation. I
Para
apologize.
facilitar, soportar, impulsar, proteger y dirigir las operaciones ilícitas. Las economías ilícitas de oro, droga, extorsión y trata de personas alcanzaron en 2024 $8.000 billones.
Can you hear us? Ms. Freitas?
De la producción de oro, ¿sí?
Can you hear us? The interpreters cannot hear you. Can you slow down and raise your voice a little bit?
Hay un delay.
There is a delay, says the speaker. The problem the interpreter is having is with the quality of the sound, which is insufficient for interpretation. It's not the speed.
Dígame. Sí, la oigo con delay.
I'm hearing you, but with a delay, says the speaker. I can hear you, though.
Okay. Please proceed now.
Okay, perfecto.
Very well.
El punto número 2. Las organizaciones criminales nacionales e internacionales
national and international criminal organizations
tienen una relación simbiótica con la
have a symbiotic relationship with the regime of Nicolas Maduro, sharing capacity, using the state structures to facilitate their work and to protect illicit operations. In gold, for example, drugs, extortion, and human trafficking. And according to our estimates, this accounts for about $8 billion. Gold, for example, only 20% is reported to the National Treasury. The rest goes to private accounts where there are members and allies with the government. This mining industry has exploited so many people using national parks and also the Amazon area. And then to launder the money from corruption, the network has money laundering structures that are very sophisticated. And since 2021, and they've been involved in this work. 3, great corruption has led to a decrease in the income of the state and therefore public expenditure, and therefore affecting the quality of basic services. The current economy is in crisis. There's no money either to service the debt. Although Venezuela has been in technical default since 2017. We owe more than $15 million. 4, Venezuelans have had to learn to live with just a few hours of electricity per day in very many parts of the country. And we've learned to protect ourselves from daily extortion from the armed Colombian groups or the organized crime groups, but also elements of the state. So many families only have one meal per day below the calories that they need, affecting their nutrition, which is getting worse day by day. Humanitarian programs are not sufficient. And then 5, there's no checks and balances between government departments. The government has captured all institutions, beginning with the justice institutions and also the oil company responsible for the majority of income for the country. In order to maintain control and the impunity of these illicit operations, a repressive system that's getting worse and worse is being applied. And today there are more than 1,000 political prisoners. At the end of the year, 26 people died during torture or because of a lack of medical care. The United Nations has documented many of these cases. We need a transparent state that is accountable, that will guarantee the rule of law and human rights, that will protect public goods for everyone without privilege, a system that's autonomous and independent. We need investment in building capacity that will enable us to have a dignified life. We must respect the will of the Venezuelan people to live in peace and democracy. And finally, a request to you. Freedom for all political prisoners in the country. Thank you very much.
I thank to Ms. Freitas for her briefing. I now give the floor to those council members who wish to make statements. I give the floor to the representative of Colombia.
Señor Presidente,
Mr. President,
Colombia
would like to thank Somalia in your quality as President of the Security Council for having quickly responded to our request to convene this emergency meeting, as well as thanking China and Russia for their support for holding of this meeting. And we wish you, Mr. President,
una exitosa gestión durante este mes de enero,
a successful month
delicado
managing the work of the Council at a particularly delicate time for international peace and security. I'd also like to thank Under-Secretary General for Political Affairs and Peace Building of the United Nations and the invited briefers. We thank them all for their briefings. This is the first time Colombia is taking the floor in the Security Council as a non-permanent member for the period 2026-2027. Colombia is taking on this responsibility with a deep sense of duty, and we are going to do this from the first day, defending international law and the purposes and principles enshrined in the United Nations Charter. International peace and security, the peaceful settlement of disputes, the prohibition of the use of force, sovereign equality, respect for the territorial integrity and political independence of all states. Colombia condemns categorically the events that occurred in the early morning of the 3rd of January in Venezuela, where we saw multiple explosions and air activity over Caracas and other areas of the country as part of a military attack carried out by the United States, which included bombings of civilian and military infrastructure, creating panic amongst the population. All of this represents clear violations of the sovereignty, political independence, and the territorial integrity of Venezuela. There is no justification whatsoever under any circumstances for the unilateral use of force to commit an act of aggression. Such actions constitute a serious violation of international law and the United Nations Charter, including the prohibition on the use or the threat of the use of force, the principle of the respect for sovereignty and the full authority of states over their territory, including their natural resources, the territorial integrity of states, and the principles of collective defense, particularly when they directly endanger the population and civilian assets. Defending these principles is not an option. Indeed, it's a common obligation that we have in order to preserve international peace and security. We need to remember that the provisions of the Charter allow for the use of force only under exceptional circumstances, in legitimate defense in the face of an armed attack, or when there is an express authorization by this Council in accordance with Chapter 7. And even in those cases, This does not amount to assuming political control of another state. In this regard, we reject any unilateral military action, any act that could worsen the situation or endanger the civilian population, and we would call for a de-escalation and non-resort to the use of force, which endangers people finding themselves in this delicate situation. They must be the absolute priority. We have learned from our experience that the civilian population is always the one that pays the highest price in armed conflict. Mr. President, Latin America and the Caribbean have proclaimed themselves to be a zone of peace, and this collective commitment and will of our region must be respected. Unilateral action that is contrary to international law endangers regional stability, increases insecurity, and worsens the already complex conditions being faced by the civilian population, with devastating effects that will transcend the sovereign borders of Venezuela to have a direct impact on countries of the region, such as Colombia. In order to act preventively, Colombia has engaged in measures to protect the civilian population and preserve the stability of the border, addressing the possible needs of the population, particularly the migrant population, in coordination with local authorities. Colombia has been and will continue to be show solidarity in receiving the Venezuelan people who, given the uncertainty created by these attacks, this may lead to a massive outflow of migration, which will require significant efforts in terms of resources and capacities to provide the necessary support and assistance to those areas affected by taking in the migrants. Mr. President, these actions that we have seen remind us of the worst interference in our area in the past, in our zone of peace, and calls to mind the commitment that we have as states to resolve our differences peacefully through dialogue and negotiation or other forms of peaceful settlement in full accordance with international law and with its instruments to which we have subscribed at the hemispheric and regional levels, such as the Charter of the Organization of American States. It's also important to understand the dimension of this situation for international peace and security beyond our region, particularly when a permanent member of the Security Council takes the decision to use force and assume control unilaterally of another sovereign state, with the aim, amongst other things, of taking its natural and strategic resources. This is very worrisome for the international community, the international order that was established after the Second World War, and flagrantly violates international law and is in clear contradiction with the United Nations Charter and the very goal for which this council was created. If a country, and particularly a country that is a permanent member of this council, disregards international law that we designed in San Francisco, what then is the role of this council, and where are the foundations for international peace and security? We are accepting that the law and the interests of the strongest prevail over multilateralism and over agreements that we have forged with dialogue and diplomacy in this very chamber. Democracy cannot be promoted or defended through violence or coercion, and it cannot be superseded either by economic interests. Democracy can only be built and sustained through respect for the will of peoples, the reaffirmation of the rule of law through political dialogue and peaceful and inclusive processes. Venezuela deserves to live in peace, in democracy, prosperity, and dignity, with a government that is defined in sovereignty by no one else than the Venezuelan people and their institutions. This is why Colombia has reiterated its call to open up paths for democracy in Venezuela through specific popular decisions being taken. The importance of preserving peace, respect for international law, and the protection of life and human rights must prevail over anything else. Colombia reaffirms its conviction that working tirelessly under these principles in our new role as a non-permanent member of the Security Council is what we plan to do, and we make ourselves available, our good offices available for a diplomatic way out of the current crisis in this brotherly country. We will meet our responsibility, primary responsibility, to maintain international peace and security. And given the seriousness of the events, we will continue to pay attention to this issue. And we'd also like to thank the Secretary General of the United Nations for providing his good offices to defend the purposes and principles of the United Nations Charter, to activate channels for mediation available to him and facilitate dialogue with the parties concerned, looking in the search for alternatives that will make it possible to find a way out of the situation led by Venezuelans themselves and provide assistance to Venezuelans that need this. In conclusion, we'd urge the parties to exercise maximum caution and restraint, to de-escalate tensions, and to follow dialogue and diplomatic channels, and develop mechanisms to avoid continued flagrant violations of international law. This will require the help of the United Nations and of regional organizations. Thank you very much, Mr. President.
I thank the representative of Colombia for her statement, and now give the floor to the representative of Russian Federation.
Mr. President, first and foremost, we wish to congratulate you on your accession to the presidency of the Security Council. And second, we wish to welcome the newly elected members of the Security Council. The beginning of this new year shocked all of those throughout the world who cherished the hope that respect for international law and non-intervention in domestic affairs of other states, as well as a reliance upon diplomacy and seeking of compromise, became key principles in the work of the new U.S. administration. The assault against the leader of Venezuela, compounded by the deaths of dozens of Venezuelan and Cuban citizens, in the eyes of many, has become a harbinger of a turn back to the era of lawlessness and U.S. domination by force, chaos, and lawlessness, which continues to afflict dozens of states in various regions of the world. There is no and can be no justification for the crimes cynically perpetrated by the United States in Caracas. We firmly condemn the U.S. act of armed aggression against Venezuela in breach of all international legal norms. In connection with the confirmed reports about the presence of the abducted president of Venezuela, Nicolas Maduro, and his spouse in the United States, today, as we are aware, they are in New York, we call upon, corrects the Speaker, the U.S. leadership to immediately release the legitimately elected president of an independent state and his spouse. Any problems existing or conflict between the United States and Venezuela need to be resolved through dialogue. And this is precisely what is enshrined in the UN Charter, the purposes and the principles of which a number of states in recent years have begun to apply selectively, depending upon the political landscape. Today, we are reaping the consequences of their recklessness and selectivity in matters related to respect for the norms of international law, which were linked to the so-called rules-based world order. Here is your rules-based world order in all of its glory, which is horrifying even the staunchest Atlanticists. Mr. President, we extend our firm solidarity with the people of Venezuela in the face of the external aggression. We firmly support and completely support the policy of the Bolivarian government, which is geared towards protection of their national interests and the sovereignty of the country. Washington's aggressive acts have already been condemned by many states and multilateral associations, including the Non-Aligned Movement, the African Union, as well as a group of friends in defense of the Charter of the United Nations. We hope that the international banditry will immediately be met with objective and comprehensive assessment at the international legal level with United Nations, universal mechanisms, and other multilateral formats being brought to bear. This process must not be impacted by the recognition or non-recognition by any given states or groups of states of the legitimacy of Nicolas Maduro. For this reason, unintelligible murmurings and attempts to avoid principled assessments by those who, in other circumstances, froth at the mouth and demand that others respect the UN Charter, today seem particularly hypocritical and unseemly. We hope you will recognize this, and we hope that you will abandon double standards and that you will not attempt to justify such an egregious act of aggression due to a fear of angering the American global gendarme, which is attempting to once again rear its head. We are particularly appalled by the unparalleled cynicism with which Washington did not even attempt to conceal the true aims of its criminal operation, namely the establishment of unbridled control over Venezuela's natural resources and the assertion of their hegemonical ambitions in Latin America. In this way, Washington is generating fresh momentum for neocolonialism and for imperialism, which were repeatedly, decisively condemned and repudiated by the peoples of this region and by the global South as a whole. Distinguished colleagues, under these circumstances, it is exceedingly important for the entire international community to unite and to definitively reject the methods and tools of U.S. military foreign policy, which have been demonstrated in the case of Venezuela. This is the only way it is possible to compel Washington to revisit and to abandon their dangerous misconceptions. As we stated during previous meetings on Venezuela, the bell now tolls across the region, ringing for every country of the Western Hemisphere. The bell is ringing for all UN member states and for the future of the organization itself. Failing to hear this call today is tantamount to projecting cowardice and the lack of principle, essentially blessing ongoing encroachments of international law and rejecting civilized international conduct as a whole. We cannot allow the United States to proclaim itself as some kind of a supreme judge which alone bears the right to invade any country, to label culprits, to hand down and to enforce punishments, irrespective of notions of international law, sovereignty, and non-intervention. Is this the world we sought to attain as we marked the 80th anniversary of the adoption of the Charter of the United Nations, when we all signed on to the relevant Security Council presidential statement? Is this the aim of United Nations reform, which we all advocate? Or has the United Nations and Security Council thereof, do they no longer exist? And is there need now to seek from Washington a patent to rule, so to speak? And is the self-determination of every person's and their right to determine their future worthless? These are the questions that we all must address today. And if this response is sincere, if it is principled, then perhaps the U.S. leadership, too, which openly is asserting intention to run another country for the benefit of the United States, they will perhaps glance at their own constitution, their constitution of the United States, which begins with the words, "We the people of the United States," and will begin, in fact, to recognize the sovereignty of other states rather than deposing inconvenient regimes. Thank you.
I thank the representative of Russian Federation and now give the floor to the representative of China.
主席，
President.
中方支持安理会就美国对委内瑞拉发动军事打击召开紧急会议。感谢迪卡洛副秘书长宣读古特雷斯秘书长的通报。我认真听取了通报人的发言，欢迎委内瑞拉常驻代表和其他国家代表出席会议。1月3日，美国悍然对委内瑞拉发动大规模军事打击，强行控制委内瑞拉总统马杜罗
seized Venezuelan President Nicolas Maduro and his wife and took them out of the country. It claimed that it will run Venezuela and even didn't rule out launching a second round of military operations on an even larger scale. China is deeply shocked by and strongly condemns the unilateral, illegal, and bullying acts of the U.S. For some time now, the international community has repeatedly expressed grave concern over the U.S. sanctions, blockade, and threats of force against Venezuela. The Council convened 2 emergency meetings, during which Secretary-General Guterres, many Council members, and countries in the region and beyond unanimously called for abiding by the UN Charter and the international law, maintaining calm and restraint, resolving disputes peacefully, de-escalating tensions, and safeguarding regional stability. However, as a permanent member of the Council, the U.S. has disregarded the grave concerns of the international community, wantonly trampled upon Venezuela's sovereignty, security, and legitimate rights and interests, and seriously violated the principles of sovereign equality, non-interference in internal affairs, peaceful settlement of international disputes, and the prohibition of the use of force in international relations. These principles constitute the fundamental tenets of the UN Charter and form the cornerstone of maintaining international peace and security. The U.S. has placed its own power above multilateralism and military action above diplomatic efforts, posing a grave threat to peace and security in Latin America and the Caribbean, and indeed internationally. China firmly opposes this, and the international community has also expressed widespread grave concern and strong condemnation. We urge the U.S. to heed the overwhelming voice of the international community, abide by international law and the purposes and principles of the UN Charter, cease infringing upon the sovereignty and security of other countries, stop toppling the government of Venezuela, and return to the path of political solutions through dialogue and negotiations. We call on the U.S. to ensure the personal safety of President Maduro and his wife and to release them at once. We support the Council in fulfilling its primary responsibility to maintain international peace and security, and we support all efforts by the UN Secretary-General, regional countries, and organizations that contribute to promoting dialogue and de-escalating the situation. President, the lessons of history are a stark warning. Military means are not the solution to problems, and the indiscriminate use of force will only lead to greater crisis. The U.S. bypassed the Council to launch military operations against Iraq, blatantly attacked Iran's nuclear facilities, and imposed economic sanctions, military strikes, and even armed occupations on multiple countries in Latin America and the Caribbean. These actions have caused persistent conflict, instability, and immense suffering for the ordinary people. Did these actions bring peace and stability? Did they bring development and prosperity? The international community sees this clearly. Venezuela is an independent sovereign state with every right to defend its sovereignty and national dignity. Countries in Latin America and the Caribbean are important forces in maintaining world peace and stability and promoting global development and prosperity, and they have every right
to independently choose their development paths and partners. No country can act as the world's police, nor can any state presume to be the international judge. China firmly supports the government and people of Venezuela in safeguarding their sovereignty, security, and legitimate rights and interests. We firmly support the regional countries in upholding the status of Latin America and the Caribbean as a zone of peace. We demand that the United States change its course, cease its bullying and coercive practices, and develop relations and cooperation with regional countries on the basis of mutual respect, equality, and non-interference in international affairs. China stands ready to work with the regional countries and the international community to strengthen solidarity and cooperation, uphold fairness and justice, and jointly safeguard peace and stability in Latin America and the Caribbean. I thank you, President.
I thank the representative of China for the statement and now give the floor to the representative of Liberia.
Thank you, Mr. President. I have the honor to deliver this statement on behalf of the A3 members, namely the Democratic Republic of Congo, Somalia, and my own country, Liberia. We thank the presidency for promptly convening this important meeting. We congratulate Somalia on assuming the presidency of the Security Council this month and warmly welcome all new members. The A3 appreciates USG DiCarlo's comprehensive briefing and listened carefully to the remarks offered by civil society representatives. We also welcome the representative of Venezuela and the representatives of the region to this meeting. Mr. President, the A3 aligns itself with the recent communique of the African Union on the situation in the Bolivarian Republic of Venezuela and continues to monitor developments there with deep concerns. In particular, we note reports regarding the detention of President Nicolas Maduro and his wife and incidents involving Venezuelan institutions. Such developments present serious challenges not only to Venezuela's internal stability, but also underscore the imperative to safeguard the broader peace and security of the region. The A3 remains steadfast in its commitment to the fundamental principles of international law, including the full respect for the sovereignty and territorial integrity of states as enshrined in the Charter of the United Nations in the interest of regional stability and international peace. We believe these are essential foundations for international cooperation and peaceful coexistence. Our position underscores the importance of dialogue, the peaceful settlement of disputes, and respect for constitutional and institutional frameworks. Mr. President, the complex situation in Venezuela requires a comprehensive response that is both inclusive and nationally owned. We continue to hold that a sustainable and peaceful resolution can only be found through constructive dialogue among Venezuelans themselves with genuine respect for the aspiration and rights of the Venezuelan people and with the constructive support of the international community. The A3 expresses its solidarity with the people of Venezuela and reiterates the African Union's commitment to peace, stability, and mutual respect among nations and regions. It's important for all parties, both within Venezuela and in the broader international community, to exercise restraint and responsibility, upholding international law and avoiding any action that could escalate tension or threaten regional stability. The A3 stands ready to support all efforts within this Council and in cooperation with regional partners to facilitate a peaceful, inclusive, and lasting resolution to the situation in Venezuela. I thank you.
I thank the representative of Liberia for the statement and now give the floor to the representative of the United States.
Mr. President, thank you for chairing. And I particularly want to thank you, Mr. Freitas, for your briefing. And I'll point out that Mr. Freitas is in exile, having fled the regime. Thank you for your courage, and thank you for shedding a light on the true atrocities of the illegitimate Maduro regime. This past weekend, colleagues, the United States successfully carried out a surgical law enforcement operation facilitated by the U.S. military against two indicted fugitives of American justice, narco-terrorist Nicolas Maduro and Celia Flores. Colleagues, Nicolas Maduro is responsible for attacks on the people of the United States, for destabilizing the Western Hemisphere, and illegitimately repressing the people of Venezuela. As Secretary Rubio has said, there is no war against Venezuela or its people. We are not occupying a country. This was a law enforcement operation in furtherance of lawful indictments that have existed for decades. The United States arrested a narco-trafficker who is now going to stand trial in the United States in accordance with the rule of law for the crimes he's committed against our people for 15 years. A similar action was taken in 1989 against Manuel Noriega. He was arrested, indicted, convicted in a court of law, served in prison in the United States and in Panama, and the Panamanian people, the American people, are safer for it. And undeniably, the region was more stable. This law enforcement action was directed consistent with the President of the United States' responsibility as Commander-in-Chief to protect Americans at home and abroad against a fugitive who is directly responsible for narco-terrorism that has killed hundreds of thousands of Americans and created destabilizing violence throughout our hemisphere. Nicolas Maduro and his co-defendant, Celia Flores, have been transferred here to the United States to stand trial for their crimes. Maduro was indicted by a grand jury in the Southern District of New York and faces very serious criminal charges for his involvement in a wide-ranging conspiracy to conduct narco-terrorism, to traffic cocaine and other drugs, and conducting international weapons trafficking. The overwhelming evidence of his crimes will be presented openly in U.S. court proceedings. Colleagues, Maduro is not just an indicted drug trafficker. He was an illegitimate so-called president. He was not a head of state. For years, Maduro and his cronies have manipulated Venezuela's electoral system to maintain their illegitimate grip on power. In fact, just 2 years ago in 2024, a UN panel of experts report found that the election in that year was absolutely and completely a farce and fell well short of the most basic transparency and integrity measures essential to upholding credible elections. If the UN and the United Nations in this body confers legitimacy on an illegitimate narco-terrorist and the same treatment in this charter of a democratically elected president or head of state, what kind of organization is this? We should note that over 50 countries, many nations, including the European Union, including a number of Latin American countries in the region, and of course the United States, again, over 50 countries rejected the legitimacy of Maduro's re-election following the disputed 2024 elections and do not recognize him as Venezuela's legitimately elected president. Maduro unlawfully refused to peacefully cede power after the Venezuelan people voted him out of office in the 2024 election. So therefore, Maduro was a fugitive from justice. He is the head of a vicious foreign terrorist organization, Cartel de los Soles. This regime-sponsored enterprise coordinates with and relies on other vicious criminal organizations, namely Tren de Aragua, again, among others, to carry out its objective of using illegal narcotics as a weapon against the United States. And for its part, Tren de Aragua is a designated foreign terrorist organization with thousands of members, many of whom have unlawfully infiltrated the United States and are conducting irregular warfare and undertaking hostile actions against the American people and against the United States. It's terrorizing criminals commit brutal crimes, including murders, kidnappings, extortions, and human, drug, and weapons trafficking. This administration, President Trump, will not stand for it. In fact, in March of 2025, President Trump declared that Tren de Aragua is quote, Tren de Aragua is undertaking hostile actions and conducting irregular warfare against the territory of the United States, both directly and at the direction, clandestine or otherwise, of the Maduro regime in Venezuela. Maduro and his cronies have partnered with some of the most violent and prolific drug traffickers and narco-terrorists in the world for decades, facilitating the flood of illegal drugs coming in the United States, estimated to be several hundred tons annually. He has become rich, incredibly wealthy, off the misery of untold numbers of Americans, Venezuelans, and others, aiding and abetting international terrorist organizations like Hezbollah, coordinating with corrupt Iranian officials, and other malign actors to influence not only the region, but to malignly influence the United States. In fact, in its own 2025 World Drug Report, the United Nations Office on Drugs and Crime identified Venezuela as a key trafficking route in the Western Hemisphere for illegal drugs, predominantly cocaine, entering the United States and increasingly Europe. As Secretary Rubio stated just yesterday, this is the Western Hemisphere. This is where we live. And we're not going to allow the Western Hemisphere to be used as a base of operation for our nation's adversaries and competitors and rivals of the United States. You can't turn Venezuela into the operating hub for Iran, for Hezbollah, for gangs, for Cuban intelligence agents, and other malign actors that control that country. You cannot continue to have the largest energy reserves in the world under the control of adversaries of the United States, under the control of illegitimate leaders, and not benefiting the people of Venezuela, and stolen by a handful of oligarchs inside of Venezuela. But it doesn't stop there. Numerous UN and international human rights organizations have issued reports documenting serious human rights abuses by the Maduro regime, including reports of extrajudicial killings, political prisoners, torture, and arbitrary and unlawful detentions. In fact, over 8 million Venezuelans have fled the country, destabilizing their neighbors in the region and creating the world's largest refugee crisis. Members of this council, colleagues, the United States wants a better future for Venezuela. We believe a better future for the people of Venezuela and for the people of the region and the world is stabilizing the region and making the neighborhood that we live in a much better and safer place. And this is why millions of Venezuelans that have fled this brutal regime are celebrating and cheering around the world as this body pontificates, including those celebrating are including in my home state of Florida, where hundreds of thousands of Venezuelans have fled this regime's brutality. I want to reiterate, President Trump gave diplomacy a chance. He offered Maduro multiple off-ramps. He tried to de-escalate. Maduro refused to take them. President Trump made it clear that the narco-terrorism must stop, and yet it continued. The United States will not waver in our actions to protect Americans from the scourge of narco-terrorism and seeks peace, liberty, and justice for the great people of Venezuela. I thank you, Mr. President.
I thank the representative of the United States and now give the floor to the representative of Panama.
Gracias, señor presidente.
Thank you, Mr. President.
Extendemos la más cordial bienvenida
I'd like to extend a warm welcome to the representatives of Bahrain, Colombia, Liberia, Latvia, and the Democratic Republic of Congo, and who have joined the Security Council as elected members and who are joining us today in the chamber. And we congratulate Somalia on assuming the presidency of the Security Council this month. I'd like to thank the Secretary General for Political Affairs, Rosemarie DiCarlo, for her detailed report representing Secretary General Antonio Guterres. She's briefed us on the situation under discussion today. We're also very grateful for the very valuable presentations by Mr. Jeffrey Sachs and Ms. Mercedes de Freitas. In this context, the Republic of Panama would like to refer to the situation that has taken place in the territory of the Bolivarian Republic of Venezuela, which is of concern due to its possible impact on peace and regional stability. However, in the light of the unfortunate reality of the facts that we've seen, we now need to turn our attention constructively towards the future of Venezuela. However, it's important to point out that in terms of a constant principle of our foreign policy, Panama would like to reiterate our unfailing commitment to multilateralism, to the sovereignty of states, and to the unrestricted respect for international law, especially the principles enshrined in the United Nations Charter, including non-intervention, respect for territorial integrity, and the prohibition of the use of force. This is mentioned in Article 2 of the United Nations Charter. These principles are, and they continue to be, the indispensable framework for the peaceful coexistence between nations. Panama also
believes it's necessary to highlight that the situation Venezuela is facing is unfolding in an environment marked by the disregard for the will of its people, as well as by a sustained erosion of democratic institutions. In this regard, Panama reiterates that it does not and will not recognize the authoritarian and illegitimate regime that has held Venezuelan men and women hostage, plunged them into one of the gravest political, social, humanitarian, and security crises in our region. Unfortunately, we have witnessed how the situation has gradually deteriorated under the regime, especially over the last year, with increased systemic erosion of democracy, the hollowing out of institutions, and the rise of authoritarian and repressive practices, which have contributed to an unfortunate outcome and therefore cannot be ignored by the international community. In particular, it is essential to call for the unconditional release of persons detained for political reasons. Many of them have been deprived of their liberty merely for raising their voices in a context in which dissent is not tolerated. From this moment on, we must demand that all political prisoners that the regime continues to hold hostage, Venezuelans and foreigners alike, be released without delay. Their physical well-being and safety must be guaranteed. Likewise, freedom of expression and the unequivocal respect for human rights must be immediately ensured. In this context, Panama underscores that its position does not stem solely from a principled democratic solidarity, but also from direct impact. A Panamanian citizen, Mr. Olmedo Núñez, remains arbitrarily detained in Venezuela without formal charges, without due process, without full access to a defense, and without effective consular guarantees. Added to this is the human impact of a multidimensional crisis that has forced around 9 million Venezuelans, men and women, to leave their homes, compelled to live in displacement and vulnerability as a consequence of the institutional and social collapse generated by the regime. A crisis that has had significant regional repercussions, reflected both in the irregular migration flows from south to north of a significant number of Venezuelan nationals, as well as reverse migration movements, including also a lot of Venezuelans, the effects of which are felt particularly in countries of transit and destination that this affects, including Panama. And this has decisively contributed to illegal migration. In the face of this reality, Panama issues a clear and firm call for Venezuela's short-term future to be fully democratic. Power emanates from the people, and as stated by His Excellency, the President of the Republic of Panama, José Raúl Molino, the people, the true sovereign, have already spoken at the polls, granting an indisputable victory with 70% of the votes on July 28, 2024, to the opposition candidate, Mr. Edmundo González Urrutia, as well as to María Corina Machado, who was prevented by the regime from running despite having won the primary with 93% of the votes on October 22, 2023. Additionally, the popularity of both has increased in recent months, including among police and military sectors. The elected government has the teams and work programs ready to be implemented immediately, guaranteeing an orderly transition that provides the rule of law, respect for human rights, and confidence. In line with this commitment, Panama proudly safeguards the electoral records that reliably certify said victory as testimony to the inalienable right of the Venezuelan people to determine their own political destiny. Recognizing any authority other than that of the elected president would amount to legitimizing electoral fraud, normalizing authoritarianism, and undermining the universal principle of free elections as the source of legitimacy. Likewise, any attempt to establish a permanent government headed by figures from the repressive apparatus, such as Delcy Rodriguez, would constitute continuity of the system and not a genuine transition. Any political solution must be peaceful, it must be democratic, and led by the Venezuelans, with the responsible assistance of the international community, including the United Nations and regional mechanisms such as the Organization of American States. Panama does not wish and would like to avoid a scenario in which Venezuela's reality simply evolves into a change from one crisis to another, one crisis replacing another. There can be no genuine transition with Madurismo if it remains. Or if we have the same power structures preserved under new names. Any arrangement that keeps figures associated with the repressive apparatus at the center of governance would, in practice, constitute continuity of the system and not a real transition. Comparative experience shows that merely nominal transitions tend to prolong conflicts, intensify migratory flows, and perpetuate regional instability to the detriment of international peace and security. Panama will always stand in solidarity with an orderly and democratic transition process, anchored in the popular will already expressed at the polls on July 28, 2024, aimed at restoring democratic institutions through an interim period strictly limited in time, the sole purpose of which is to create the conditions necessary for the effective exercise of the Venezuelan people's right to self-determination. As a country that recovered its democracy and sovereignty, Panama can state clearly that there can be no peace without legitimacy, nor legitimacy without democracy, and that every democracy is ultimately based on respect for the popular will. Mr. President, Panama, due to our commitment to multilateralism and international law, in its capacity as member of the Security Council, will continue to contribute responsibly to collective efforts aimed at preserving peace, strengthening democracy, and supporting legitimate and sustainable solutions anchored in the sovereign will of peoples and respect for international law. Thank you very much.
I thank the representative of Panama for the statement and now give the floor to the representative of Latvia.
Thank you, Mr. President. At the outset, I would like to congratulate Somalia on assuming the presidency of the United Nations Security Council in January and wish you all success. Latvia takes its seat on the Council with a profound sense of honor and responsibility for this role. And let me thank Under-Secretary General Rosemarie DiCarlo for today's briefing on behalf of the Secretary General, and I thank the invited briefers. The Security Council bears primary responsibility for the global efforts to uphold peace, security, and rule of law worldwide. Latvia recalls that under all circumstances, the principles of international law and the UN Charter must be upheld. All efforts now focus on ensuring de-escalation and stability in Venezuela based on inclusive dialogue and broad societal support. Latvia encourages all relevant actors to prioritize diplomatic efforts and work collectively towards a peaceful, democratic, and sustainable future for Venezuela. Latvia stands in solidarity with the people of Venezuela and their right to freedom and democracy, rights that were not respected by the Maduro regime during 2024 presidential elections and before, and which remain unmet to this day. The regime of Nicolas Maduro was rooted in mass repression, corruption, organized crime, including drug trafficking, and posed a grave threat to security of the region and the world. It has repeatedly violated the UN Charter and undermined international law, including through open support for Russia's aggression against Ukraine. The Maduro regime does not represent the will of the Venezuelan people and has relied on widespread, systematic repressions of human rights across the country to maintain power. 8 million Venezuelans have been forced to flee the country since 2014. Latvia also remains committed to working jointly together with partners to counter global transnational organized crime networks, including in Latin America and Caribbean. Such criminal activities place the lives of countless people at grave risk, particularly women and children. Addressing these challenges requires sustained cooperation in full respect of international law. Latvia continues to closely monitor the situation in Venezuela and stands prepared to continue working with its partners to support a peaceful, democratic, and just transition that reflects the aspirations of the Venezuelan people. And I thank you.
I thank the representative of Latvia for her statement and now give the floor to the representative of Denmark.
Thank you, Mr. President. And let me also thank Undersecretary General Dicarlo for her briefing on behalf of the Secretary General. We also listened carefully to the briefing by Ms. de Freitas and Mr. Sachs. Mr. President, Denmark joins the Secretary General in expressing deep concern over the evolving situation in Venezuela. Since this Council met to discuss the situation 2 weeks ago, we have seen a drastic escalation culminating in a large-scale military operation on January 3rd. At our last meeting, Denmark urged all actors to strictly adhere to international law and to de-escalate tensions and exercise the necessary restraint. Today, we echo the Secretary General in his concern regarding the worrying implications of this military action. Independent of the situation in Venezuela, these developments constitute a dangerous precedent. International law and the UN Charter, as a pillar of the international security architecture, must be respected by all states. Denmark recalls the foundational principle of international law that forbids states from threatening or using force against another state's territorial integrity and political independence. This imperative is enshrined in Article 2, Paragraph 4 of the UN Charter. Members of the UN Security Council have a special responsibility to uphold these principles. The principles of sovereignty, political independence, and territorial integrity must be respected. The inviolability of borders is not up for negotiation. These are universal, sacrosanct principles enshrined in international law. They apply everywhere. Mr. President, once again, Denmark calls on all parties to urgently de-escalate tensions that could threaten peace and stability in the region and beyond. International disputes should be settled by peaceful means, as stated in the UN Charter. We further call on all parties to exercise maximum restraint and to engage in dialogue and diplomacy. Denmark takes note of official statements from the United States government stating that the military operations are to combat drug trafficking and stem the illicit flow of illegal narcotics. Denmark shares the priority of combating organized crime and drug trafficking, while reiterating that counter-narcotic efforts, as all other efforts, must be conducted in strict accordance with international law, including the fundamental rules and principles of the UN Charter. Mr. President, against this backdrop, Denmark wishes to recall our solidarity with the people of Venezuela Denmark does not recognize Nicolás Maduro as the legitimate president of Venezuela following the lack of transparency and integrity in the 2024 presidential elections, which failed to meet basic democratic standards. In Maduro's attempts to cling to power, his authoritarian regime grew increasingly oppressive. His regime bears responsibility for widespread and systematic violations of human rights against his fellow citizens, and he should be held accountable. The victims of the Maduro regime's alleged crimes against humanity have to be heard. The Venezuelan people have a right to democracy and self-determination exercised through peaceful, inclusive, and credible democratic processes, free from fear of political persecution, intimidation, or repression, and external political interference. This includes the rights of Venezuelans alone to determine their political, economic, and social future without coercion, pressure, or manipulation by external actors. No state should seek to influence political outcomes in Venezuela through the use or threat of force or through other means inconsistent with international law. Venezuela's future can be decided only by the Venezuelans. We call on all parties and stakeholders to come together for a negotiated and peaceful transition to democratic rule in a process led by and owned by Venezuelans. At this critical and uncertain time, it is imperative that all parties fully respect human rights and international law. Denmark remains committed to supporting Venezuela and the aspirations of its people on its path to lasting political stability. I thank you.
I thank the representative of Denmark for her statement and now give the floor to the representative of the United Kingdom.
Thank you, President. I congratulate Somalia on the assumption of the presidency of the Council for the month of January. And I thank our briefers for their remarks. Colleagues, the Venezuelan people have suffered for years. This Council now meets at a pivotal moment for Venezuela's future. Maduro's actions created extreme levels of poverty, violent repression, and failing basic services. His regime's rule precipitated a displacement crisis affecting the whole region. The United Kingdom has long been clear that Maduro's claim to power was fraudulent. To date, Venezuela's National Electoral Council has failed to publish the full results of the July 2024 presidential elections, and independent domestic and international reports also observed significant irregularities and a lack of transparency. President, the United Kingdom wants to see a safe and peaceful transition to a legitimate government that reflects the will of the Venezuelan people. They deserve a government which reflects their vote at the ballot box and delivers a more stable, prosperous future for all Venezuelans. Finally, President, the United Kingdom reaffirms its commitment to international law and the principles enshrined in the Charter of the United Nations. These foundations are essential for maintaining global peace, security, and the rule of law. I thank you.
I thank the representative of the United Kingdom for his statement and now give the floor to the representative of France.
Merci, Monsieur le Président.
Thank you, Mr. President.
Je voudrais d'abord vous féliciter pour votre présidence du Conseil de sécurité au mois de janvier. Je voudrais également remercier Madame Rosemary DiCarlo de nous avoir transmis les éléments du secrétaire général des Nations Unies au sujet du dernier développement intervenu au Venezuela. Monsieur le Président, la France est restée solidaire du peuple vénézuélien dans la crise qu'il traverse depuis de trop nombreuses années, et en particulier depuis l'été 2024. Le 28 juillet 2024, le peuple vénézuélien a exercé son droit de vote de façon pacifique pour déterminer l'avenir de son pays.
of their country.
Son droit à choisir ses dirigeants
Their right to choose
lui a
their
néanmoins été
leaders
confisqué
nonetheless has been
par Nicolas
stripped
Maduro.
away from the people by Nicolas
Faut-il le
Maduro.
rappeler?
Must you recall the fact?
Le processus
The
électoral
electoral
avait été
process
marqué
has been
par de
marred,
nombreuses
was
irrégularités
marred by numerous
et le décompte final des
irregularities,
voix
and the final
par une
counting of
absence
votes was
flagrante
marred by
de
a
transparence.
flagrant lack of transparency.
Face à l'aspiration
In
démocratique du
light of
peuple
the democratic
vénézuélien,
aspirations
Nicolas
of the
Maduro
Venezuelan
a
people,
systématiquement
Nicolas
répondu
Maduro
par la
has
répression des
systematically
voix
responded
dissidentes,
with the
des membres de
repression
l'opposition
of dissident
et de la
voices
société civile,
of members of the
ainsi
opposition
que
and
par
of
de
civil society, as well as
multiples
with
détentions arbitraires.
numerous arbitrary
La France
detentions.
s'est toujours
France
exprimée
has
avec clarté
always expressed
sur le fait
itself
que ces
with clarity about the
étaient
fact that
inacceptables
these
et que le
practices
respect
are
des droits de l'homme
unacceptable and that
devait
respect
être
for human
garanti.
rights must be upheld.
Monsieur le Président,
Mr. President,
l'opération
the
militaire qui
military
a conduit
operation
à la
which has
capture
led
de
to
Nicolas
the
Maduro
capture of Nicolas Maduro
contrevient
runs
au principe
counter
de
to the
règlement
principle
pacifique des
of
différends
peaceful dispute resolution
celui
and
de non-recours à la
runs
force.
counter to the principle of non-use of
La
force.
multiplication
The
des violations de
proliferation
la
of
Charte des
violations of the
Nations
Charter
Unies
of the United
et du
Nations
droit
and the
international
violations
par
of
des États
international law
investis de la
by states
responsabilité de
vested
membres
with
permanents de ce
responsibility
Conseil
as permanent members of the Security
sape les
Council
bases
chips
de
away at the
l'ordre
very
international.
foundation of the international order.
Contrevenir aux principes de la Charte,
Contravening the principles
parmi
of the
lesquels les
Charter,
principes de respect
including
de
the principle of respect
l'indépendance
for
et de
independence
l'intégrité
and the
territoriale des
territorial
États,
integrity of states,
mine les fondements des Nations Unies
undermines the
et
foundation of the United
fragilise la paix
Nations and
et la sécurité
weakens
internationale.
international peace and security.
La France
France
fidèle
remains
et engagée
faithful
pour le
and
respect de
committed
la
to
Charte des
respect for
Nations
the
Unies
Charter
et
of the
du
United
principe
Nations
de
and of
règlement
the
pacifique des
principle
différends.
of peaceful dispute
Nous
resolution.
devons mettre en œuvre ces
We
principes
have an obligation to uphold
en
these
tout temps
principles at all
et en
times
tout lieu.
and in all places.
Leur respect
Respect for
est
these
indispensable.
principles is indispensable.
Monsieur le Président,
Mr. President,
la France
France
réitère son attachement
wishes
au
to
respect de
reiterate
la
her commitment
volonté
to respect for
du
the
peuple
for the
vénézuélien.
will of the Venezuelan
La
people.
transition qui s'ouvre à
The
présent pour le
transition which is
Venezuela doit
currently
être pacifique,
being opened up for
démocratique
Venezuela needs to be
et
peaceful
respectueuse des
and
choix du
democratic
peuple vénézuélien
and
qui est un peuple
carried out in a
souverain.
manner which respects the choice of the Venezuelan people,
Cette
a
transition
sovereign people.
doit être
This
dirigée
transition
par
must be
et
led
pour
by
les Vénézuéliens.
and for the
La
Venezuelans.
France se tient prête avec les États
France
de la
stands
région et ses
ready,
partenaires de l'Union
alongside
européenne,
states in the region
à
and
soutenir
our
le dialogue
partners at the
en
European
vue de la
Union to
restauration de la
uphold
libre
dialogue
expression
with a view to the
démocratique au
restoration of
Venezuela
the free
et à
democratic
appuyer la
expression
stabilité
in Venezuela.
régionale.
We stand ready to support regional
Ce doit être
stability.
aussi
This
le rôle
also
de ce
needs to
Conseil.
be the role
Je vous
of the
remercie.
Security Council. Thank you.
I thank the representative of France for the statement and now give the floor to the representative of Bahrain.
Mr. President, I wish to take this opportunity to congratulate first and foremost the Federal Republic of Somalia on its presidency of the Security Council during this month of January. We wish you every success. We also wish to take this opportunity to thank delegations whose mandate at the Council ended, namely Algeria, Guyana, the Republic of Korea, Sierra Leone, as well as Slovenia. We wish to thank them for their significant contributions to the attainment of the goals and the mission of the Council. I also wish to thank Madam Rosemary DiCarlo, Undersecretary General for Political and Peace-Building Affairs, for her valuable briefing related to the latest developments which have taken place at in the Bolivarian Republic of Venezuela, and I wish to thank other briefers as well. We appreciate the reaffirmation by His Excellency the Secretary General of the United Nations, reaffirmation of the commitment to the fundamental principles of the Charter of the United Nations, a commitment to the peaceful diplomatic resolution of disputes. The Kingdom of Bahrain supports the call of the Secretary General for all stakeholders in Venezuela to engage in inclusive dialogue which guarantees respect for international law, and this in order to ease tensions, to preserve regional stability, and to avoid any potential adverse repercussions for security and stability in the region. The Kingdom of Bahrain also extends its support for efforts undertaken at the regional and international levels in order to reduce tensions and to enhance diplomatic means in order to provide for international peace and security. The Kingdom stresses the importance of the promotion of international cooperation in order to support all regional regional and international efforts, which are geared towards combating international organized crime, trafficking in drugs, as well as scourges which are related to this. This undermines the stability of societies, undermines achievement of sustainable development. Therefore, these issues need to be dealt with in accordance with international relevant conventions. By way of conclusion, the Kingdom of Bahrain reaffirms our support for regional and international efforts to achieve a political, lasting solution in the Bolivarian Republic of Venezuela. This needs to be achieved through regional cooperation and with respect for national sovereignty. The goal is to provide for security and stability in Venezuela, to avoid risks of conflict and division, to protect civil peace, and to contribute to the preservation of regional security and stability, as well as international peace and security. Thank you, Mr. President.
I thank the representative of Bahrain for the statement, and now give the floor to the representative of Pakistan.
Thank you, Mr. President. Allow me to begin by congratulating Somalia this month and assuring you of my delegation's full support and cooperation. We welcome the new members joining the Council. I thank Undersecretary General Rosemary DiCarlo for reading out the remarks of the Secretary General and the valuable briefing. We also take note of the views shared by Mr. Jeffrey Sachs and Ms. Mercedes de Freitas. I welcome the participation of the permanent representative of Venezuela alongside the representatives of other countries from the region and beyond in the meeting. Mr. President, Pakistan views the recent developments in Venezuela with profound concern. In a world already beset by multiple crises, escalating tensions and instability in the Caribbean do not augur well for regional and international peace and security. The UN Charter enjoins us to refrain from the threat or use of force against the territorial integrity or political independence of any state. The UN Charter also binds member states to sovereign equality, non-interference in the internal affairs of others, and settlement of international disputes by peaceful means. Unilateral military action contravenes these sacrosanct principles and the doctrine of sovereign immunity. Such actions set dangerous precedents that risk eroding the foundations of the global legal framework. They also fuel instability, which, as history has shown time and again, can lead to unpredictable and uncontrollable outcomes for years to come. Mr. President, at this critical juncture, the path forward must be one of dialogue and diplomacy. Durable solutions to political differences can only be found through peaceful means, with full respect for the will of the Venezuelan people, free from any external interference. We hope that Latin American and the Caribbean region, as a zone of peace, will remain free from conflict and confrontation and continue its march towards enhanced regional cooperation and improved prosperity for the people. We urge all parties to exercise maximum restraint, de-escalate tensions, pursue peaceful coexistence, refrain from any actions that could exacerbate the volatile situation, and engage in dialogue, including by utilizing the sincere offers of mediation. The good offices of the Secretary General also always remain available for that purpose. Lastly, Mr. President, I affirm Pakistan's commitment to contributing constructively to the discharge of the Security Council's primary responsibility for addressing the threat to international peace and security by diffusing tensions, promoting Pacific settlement, and upholding respect for international law and the UN Charter. Peace and stability of Venezuela and the welfare and prosperity of its people, with full ownership, must be the overriding objective of all efforts. I thank you.
I thank the representative of Pakistan for the statement, and now give the floor to the representative of Greece.
Thank you, Mr. President. At the outset, I would like to congratulate Somalia for assuming the presidency of the Council for the month of January, and I would like to welcome the newly elected members joining the Council. I would also like to thank USG DiCarlo for her briefing on behalf of the Secretary General, as well as Mr. Sachs and Ms. De Freitas for their remarks. Mr. President, Greece is closely monitoring developments in Venezuela. We urge all actors to exercise maximum restraint and to refrain from actions that would deepen the crisis and undermine prospects for peace and stability. Greece reiterates that the Charter of the United Nations and international law, including human rights law, must always be respected. We also recall the obligation of all parties to protect civilians, especially in times of heightened tensions. Greece shares the priority of combating transnational organized crime and drug trafficking, which pose a significant security threat worldwide. We reiterate that these challenges should be addressed through sustained cooperation in full respect of international law. Mr. President, Greece firmly believes that dialogue and diplomacy are the only viable tools for a peaceful transition and a sustainable resolution of the crisis. We join the Secretary General in encouraging all actors in Venezuela to engage in inclusive and meaningful dialogue in full respect of human rights, democratic principles, and the rule of law. We have long been clear that Nicolas Maduro's and illegitimate president's claim to power lacks legitimacy. Greece has not recognized the results of the rigged elections of July 28, 2024, and has always supported initiatives aimed at achieving a democratic solution for Venezuela. We stand firmly with the people of Venezuela in their pursuit of a democratic future, and we express the hope that the recent events will lead to this effect. The voices of all Venezuelans need to be heard, and they deserve governance that reflects their will through peaceful and inclusive processes. In this spirit, we will continue to support efforts aimed at achieving a peaceful, negotiated transition that ensures the will of all Venezuelans is fully respected. Greece stands ready to support all regional and international efforts aimed at the peaceful resolution of the crisis in line with the Charter of the United Nations and international law. I thank you.
I thank the representative of Greece for this statement and now give the floor to the representative of Bolivarian Republic of Venezuela.
Muchas gracias, señor presidente.
Thank you very much, Mr. President. Before coming to the substance of our statement today, I think we need to make an institutional clarification. We note with concern that an attempt is being made to present to the Security Council a supposed representative of civil society, a person whose public career trajectory bears the hallmarks of sustained funding from foreign governments and transnational corporations. This has been the case for years, as well as participation in processes of political destabilization and the promotion of institutional breakdown in her own country. The instrumental use of this person to legitimize narratives of confrontation, justify the use of force, or minimize violations of international law does not contribute in any way to the purposes of this Council or to the strengthening of multilateralism. On the contrary, it erodes the credibility of the debates and distorts the Security Council's mandate entrusted with the maintenance of international peace and security. Mr. President, on January 3, 2026 is a date of profound historical significance, not only for Venezuela, but for the international system as a whole. On that day, the Bolivarian Republic of Venezuela was the target of an illegitimate armed attack, lacking any legal justification by the government of the United States of America, which included bombing of our territory, the loss of civilian and military lives, the destruction of civilian infrastructure, essential infrastructure, and the kidnapping of the constitutional president of the Republic, Nicolas Maduro Moros, and the First Lady Celia Flores. Venezuela comes before this Council today with a deep conviction that international peace can only be sustained if international law is respected without exception, without double standards, and without selective interpretations. The events of January 3rd constitute a flagrant violation of the UN Charter perpetrated by the US government, in particular, the principal violation of the principle of sovereign equality of states, of the absolute prohibition of the use or threat of use of force against the territorial integrity or political independence of any state, as enshrined in Article 2, Paragraph 4, and a violation of the duty to settle disputes by peaceful means. Similarly, these acts also seriously violate the Geneva Conventions and its protocols, as indiscriminate attacks were carried out against the civilian population and assets. International human rights law has also been violated, particularly the right to life, personal integrity, and security. Of particular seriousness is the kidnapping of the President of the Republic by the government of the United States of America, which constitutes a direct violation of an essential norm of the international legal order, namely the personal immunity of heads of state in office. This immunity is not an individual privilege. It is an institutional guarantee that protects the sovereignty of states and the stability of the international system. Its disregard not only affects Venezuela, but also sets an extremely dangerous precedent for all states represented in this chamber, regardless of their size, power, or alliances. Mr. President, General Assembly Resolution 3314 clearly defines as an act of aggression the bombing of the territory of one state by the armed forces of another state, as well as the invasion or occupation, even without formal annexation. The events we are denouncing here unequivocally fit this definition. In 2004, the International Court of Justice affirmed that occupation exists when a state exercises effective control, even without formal annexation or the continuous presence of troops. Security Council Resolution 242, for its part, emphasizes that the acquisition of territory by force is inadmissible, while General Assembly Resolution 2625 establishes that the territory of a state shall not be subject to military occupation as a result of the use of force in contravention of the UN Charter. Allowing such acts to go without an effective answer would amount to normalizing the replacement of law by might, while eroding the very foundations of the collective security system. Today, it is not only Venezuela's sovereignty that is at stake, the credibility of international law, the authority of this organization, and the validity of the principle that no state can set itself up as a judge, party, and executor of the world order are also at stake. Mr. President, we cannot ignore a central element of this U.S. aggression. Venezuela is the victim of these attacks because of its natural resources. Our country's oil, energy, strategic resources, and geopolitical position have historically been factors of greed and external pressure. When force is used to control resources, impose governments, or redesign states, we are faced with a logic that harks back to the worst practices of colonialism and neocolonialism. Accepting such a logic would mean to open the door to a deeply unstable world in which countries with greater military capacities can decide by force the political and economic destinies of other states. This scenario not only threatens Venezuela, it threatens international peace and security as a whole. If the kidnapping of a head of state, the bombing of a sovereign country, and the open threat of further armed action are tolerated or downplayed, the message sent to the world is a devastating one, namely that the law is optional and that force is the true arbiter of international relations. Venezuela firmly believes in diplomacy, dialogue, and peaceful coexistence among nations. That has always been our historical position, and it remains so today, even in the face of an aggression of this magnitude. It is precisely that commitment to peace, the one that was violated on the 3rd of January. Therefore, Venezuela urges the Security Council to fully assume its responsibility and to act in accordance with the mandate conferred upon it by the Charter of the United Nations. In that regard, we request, A, that the government of the United States of America be demanded to fully respect the immunities of President Nicolas Maduro and First Lady Celia Flores, as well as their immediate release and safe return to Venezuela. 2, that the use of force against the Bolivarian Republic of Venezuela be clearly and unequivocally condemned. Thirdly, that the principle of non-acquisition of territory or resources by force be reaffirmed. And 4, that measures aimed at de-escalation, the protection of the civilian population, and the restoration of international law be adopted. Mr. President, in spite of the seriousness of the events, Venezuela would like to inform this body and the international community that its institutions are functioning normally, that constitutional order has been preserved, and that the state exercises effective control over all of its territory. In accordance with our Constitution, Executive Vice President Delcy Rodriguez is being sworn in as acting President of the Republic, thereby guaranteeing institutional continuity, stability, and internal peace. We wish to convey a message of serenity, confidence, and hope to the Venezuelan people. Venezuela is a nation that believes in peace, work, and dignity. Our commitment is to diplomacy and law, and the law is firm and unwavering. We defend our sovereignty without renouncing our values. We bet on dialogue without accepting imposition. We believe in a future of coexistence, development, and mutual respect among nations. We trust that the Security Council will rise to the historic moment facing humanity and choose the path of legality, collective responsibility, and peace. Thank you very much, Mr. President.
I thank the representative of the Bolivarian Republic of Venezuela and now give the floor to the representative of Argentina.
Buenos días y muchas gracias,
good morning,
señor presidente.
And thank you very much, Mr. President.
Señor presidente,
Mr. President,
el gobierno de la República
the
Argentina
government of the Argentine Republic
valora la
values
decisión
the
y la
decision and determination demonstrated by the President of the United States of America and by his government in the recent actions taken in Venezuela that resulted in the capture of the dictator Nicolas Maduro, leader of the Cartel of the Suns, declared a terrorist organization by Argentina in 2025, the same year in which Argentina also declared the Tren de Aragua a terrorist organization. The Argentine Republic trusts that these events represent a decisive step forward against narco-terrorism that affects the region and at the same time open a stage that will allow the Venezuelan people to fully recover democracy, the rule of law, and respect for human rights in accordance with the principles of international law, and put an end to the oppression exercised for years by the authoritarian regime that plunged the Venezuelan people into poverty and forced 8 million Venezuelans to have to flee their country. Mr. President, the illegitimate regime of Nicolas Maduro has not only constituted a direct threat to Venezuelan citizens through the systematic violation of human rights, the appropriation of the country's resources, and the destruction of democratic institutions, but also to the entire region by leading and exporting its networks of drug trafficking and organized crime. Since the inauguration of President Javier Milei, Argentina has been clear and consistent in its position regarding this situation. We have unequivocally denounced the lack of freedoms and the serious human rights violations, and we have actively contributed with determination and responsibility to international efforts aimed at the return of democracy in Venezuela.
en marzo de
In March
2024,
2024,
cuando otros
when
optaron
others
por la inacción
opted
o
for
la
inaction
ambigüedad,
or ambiguity,
la Argentina otorgó asilo
Argentina
diplomático a
granted
6 líderes
diplomatic
opositores
asylum to 6
venezolanos,
Venezuelan
asumiendo un
opposition
enorme
leaders,
desafío
assuming
para
an
nuestra
enormous
representación
challenge
en
for our
Caracas.
representation in Caracas.
Posteriormente, tras
Subsequently,
denunciar el carácter
after
fraudulento del
denouncing the
resultado
fraudulent
anunciado
nature of the
en las
result
elecciones del
announced
28
in
de
the
julio de
28
2024,
July 2024
reconocer a
elections,
Edmundo González
and
Urrutia como
recognizing Edmundo
presidente electo,
González
la Argentina
Urrutia
fue
as
expulsada de
president-elect,
Venezuela.
Argentina
Nuestra
was
embajada,
expelled from
donde
Venezuela.
permanecían los
Our embassy,
asilados,
where the asylum
fue
seekers
objeto
remained,
de un
was subject
asedio
to
permanente.
a permanent siege.
A pesar de estas presiones,
Despite these
la
pressures,
República
the
Argentina
Argentine
mantuvo
Republic
intacta su
maintained its
convicción de
unwavering
continuar
conviction
denunciando la
to
situación
continue
venezolana
denouncing the
y de
situation in
actuar en todos
Venezuela
los
and to
foros
act
internacionales
in
disponibles
every available